Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming this lunchtime. My name is Professor Niamh Daeid. I'm the director of the Leverhulme Research Centre for Forensic Science in the School of Science and Engineering here at the University of Dundee. The first thing I was told to say is we are not expecting a fire alarm. So if there is a fire alarm, there is a fire exit over there, and that's the direction of travel for you if the alarm goes off. Also welcome to everybody who is joining us online. I know we have people from a wide variety of different places, including some students, I think secondary school students from schools who are going to be joining us for this session, and so you are very welcome indeed, as are all of you. We're really proud to host this session, and we are working in collaboration with the Royal Statistical Society to bring two fantastically interesting speakers to you this afternoon to talk about, I think, a subject and a topic that is becoming more and more part of our lives, and that's the area of misleadingness. And so the topic is the misuse of statistical evidence and what does it mean to be misleading. We're joined, as I said, by two really excellent speakers who are looking at this from very different perspectives. One from the perspective of regulation, would that be fair to say, Ed, and the other from a more philosophical standpoint. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of the speakers to introduce themselves rather than me doing it, so that you get a bit of a flavour of who we have that's going to be talking to us about this topic. And then each has prepared a short opening statement that's just going to set the scene from their different perspectives. And then we'll start with a couple of questions, just picking up those themes. And we'll do that for about maybe half an hour, 35 minutes, seeing how the conversation progresses. But that's your time to start thinking about what's my burning question that I would like to ask. And then we'll do questions from the floor. If you'll just, I'll put up your hands when I ask for questions, and then I'll call on you, and we'll see where that direction takes us. So Ed, can I start with you, please, if you just introduce yourself?
Thank you very much. I'm Ed Humpherson, and I have an incredibly cool job. I'm the head of an organisation called the Office for Statistics Regulation. And our role is to ensure that statistics, official statistics produced by government, serve the public good. And I'll say a little bit more about what that involves. But one thing it involves is making judgments as to when the use of statistics has been misleading. And that's what I'm going to focus on this afternoon. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Rowan.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for inviting me. I'm Rowan Cruft. Parts of my job are as exciting as Ed's, but maybe not all of them. So I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Stirling. My research has focused on two main areas: on rights, human rights, and the concept of rights, and then more recently on democratic legitimacy and public debate, and the way that public debate feeds into democratic legitimacy. And that's the main link to the misuse of statistics that I'll be talking about.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Ed, can we start with you? And I know you're going to stand out here to just go through some of your points.
I'm standing there because if I was to speak from where I was sitting, you wouldn't be able to see the slide. And there is a slide that I want you to see in a couple of seconds. Well, thank you very much. It is very common these days to hear the accusation that someone has said something misleading. It might be somebody has made a misleading claim or alleged misleading claim about the economy, or they've made an assertion that crime is falling. What's on the side of a bus might be described as misleading. I've found out that a former US president made 30,573 misleading statements in his time in office. I even this morning found an analysis of misleading movie posters and misleading movie trailers. I'm going to argue that when the word misleading is very abundant and people use the term misleadingness quite indiscriminately, that we need to think rigorously about what it means to be misleading with statistics. And I'm going to make three propositions. Number one, we need to zero in on use. and be careful not to confuse misleading use with other problems. Number two, we need to recognise that judging misleadingness is not a moral or a quantitative judgment. It's a different kind of judgment. And number three, instead of a moral or quantitative judgment, we need to focus on the gap between the claim and what statistics actually say. So let's zero in on use. So lots of people contact me in my job and they say that a particular claim by a politician is misleading. And they contact me because I'm the head of the UK statistics regulator, and our role, as I've said, is to ensure that statistics serve the public good. And they want a kind of ruling from me on that question of misleadingness. Now, for the most part in my work, our work, my team's work, we focus on the production of statistics, how data are collected, how statistics are compiled, how they're presented. And there are loads of risks in how statistics are produced. There are data gaps. There are places where statistics are not representative of the whole population. Sometimes statistics are withheld. They're not published when they should be. Sometimes there are just straightforward errors. So there's a lot of stuff there that people can be concerned about. But that's not the subject of today. Today we're zeroing in on the part of statistics serving the public good is not how they're produced, but how they are used, and in particular, how they are used by politicians in public debate. So political argument is essentially about making persuasive arguments. My policy is best because. Their policy is rubbish because. And often campaigners, politicians, will want to use a lot of statistical evidence to support their narrative. And let me be clear, this is really good. We really like it when politicians use statistics. We want people to use statistics. But we also want to make sure that the way statistics are used is not corrosive of what the statistics themselves say. So in talking about misleadingness, we need to zero in on the context in which the use takes place. So that's my first proposition. Think about use and what's going on in use. Second proposition, recognise that this isn't a moral or a quantitative judgment. So when I make judgments as a regulator on misleadingness in the use of statistics, we're not really judging people's intentions. We're not really saying you're a bad person because you intended to mislead people. We are simply clarifying the appropriate interpretation of the statistics. That's less normative. It's not a moral, ethical judgment. And we're also not making a quantitative judgment. If I judge whether a use of statistics is being misleading, I'm not going out and surveying a random sample of the population and finding out whether they're misled by it. And if 43% are misled, therefore it's misleading, but if 42% aren't, it's not. We're not doing that. We're not making a quantitative assertion. To repeat, we are simply clarifying interpretation. So what are we doing? Well, my third proposition, we are focusing on the gap between a claim and what the statistics actually say. And that leads to this definition. This is the working definition we use in every case. I'll read it very briefly. We consider a use to be misleading when, on a question of significant public interest, the way statistics are used is likely to leave audiences believing something which the relevant statistical evidence would not support. So you have a politician, they want to make an argument, they select a statistic. It's misleading if, and only if, when you go to the source, you'd conclude something different from what they're proposing. So let me illustrate that with a couple of examples, bring this to life. Former Prime Minister of the UK, Boris Johnson, about a year and a half ago, was very fond of saying that employment, there are 430,000 more people in employment at that time, January 2022, than 2 years previously. 430,000 more people in employment. So what do? We go to the source. And what does the source say? Well, you could find that 430,000 number. That was in there. That was the number of people who are in full-time payroll employment. So you say, well, that's okay. But then you look at the full relevant statistical evidence and you discover that there are other categories of employment. There are people who are part-time payroll employees. There are people who are self-employed. They are in employment, but they're not within that number. And if you add all of those together, you'd find that total employment was actually down. To us, that's a fairly straightforward, slam dunk example of misleadingness. A number is put forward, portrayed as being a figure of employment, but it's a figure for a subset of employment. Another example here in Scotland, the Scottish government has been very fond of saying that Scotland represents 25% of Europe's offshore wind potential. So what do you do? What do? We go to the source. What is the source for that claim? And you have to be quite a skilled detective to find the source of that claim. You discover it's based on two separate reports from about 20 years ago, compiled on completely different basis, one estimating Scotland's offshore wind potential and one estimating the offshore wind potential for European countries, 11 European countries, excluding, we noted, Norway, Sweden and Finland, which have quite a lot of wind. We concluded that if you go to the source and then compare it to the claim, that's misleading. I have other examples. I have got an absolute humdinger about inflation and truncated axes, but I'll save them for Q&A because I think I'm overrunning my time. I just want to conclude. If you hear somebody saying that a use of statistics is misleading, you should ask yourself, what is the concept of misleadingness in use here? You should then zero in on the use. You should avoid a moral or a quantitative judgment, and you should check back to the source and identify a gap between the source and the claim. That's what you should do when you're thinking about misleadingness. I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Super, thank you very much indeed. Rowan.
Okay, thanks. Do you want to bring up the next slide? Thanks. So my main claim is just one. I've just got one main proposition. It's quite a simple one, which is that misuse of statistics undermines democratic legitimacy. And I just want to spend my time expanding on that. And I think part of where we may go, I was wondering about what you said, Ed. I think I might find myself saying that it is a sort of moral judgment, but not a subjective judgment of the person's character. I don't think as a regulator you should be making a moral judgment, I agree. But I think there's something moral implied by a judgment of misuse, or at least that's what I'm going to suggest, and we can maybe talk about that. But first, I just want to explain what I mean by that proposition that misuse of statistics undermines democratic legitimacy. What's legitimacy? Well, here's a quotation from a book by David Estland on legitimacy. Moral permissibility of the states issuing and enforcing its commands due to the process by which they were produced. So the thought is you might have a case of just brute power or brute force when a state just tells you to do something. But if that telling, that command is backed by the right sort of process, by people voting for a legislative programme that includes support for that command, then the state is morally allowed to use force to enforce that command in a way that it wouldn't be if it was just, say, a particular person grabbing power, grabbing control of the police and forcing this through. So legitimacy involves something like moral permission to use force. And a democratic theory of legitimacy says what you need for legitimate use of force is, on the one hand, the thing we all think of with democracy, which is equal voting, equal control of the ballot box. But we also need something like an informed debate before that control. So we can all think of countries where there's sort of voting in name, but no debate allowed. And in that kind of case, it doesn't seem like the state is really given legitimacy by the vote because ideas haven't been able to be shared. And I think, why isn't voting enough? Partly just because relevant information might be being hidden, partly also because we haven't been able to engage in the kind of thinking together that constitutes collective self-government, the thinking together that happens before the vote. So why then would misuse of statistics undermine this kind of democratic legitimacy? Well, my suggestion is that it messes the debate. The debate bit, the deliberation bit, is damaged by misuse of statistics. And here I just want you to bear with me while we go through those two bullet point examples of different ways of debating. Okay. So the first one is meant to be the sort of good case. You've got a speaker and an audience, and the audience comes to believe what the speaker says for the same reason that motivates the speaker to believe it. The audience's belief is generated by what Habermas calls, nice little phrase this, the unforced force of the better reason. So here's an example. I might take you through the steps of a mathematical proof, and this can just lead you to see the answer, to get that belief just as a matter of seeing it. Alternatively, you might present me with some evidence for something, and again, in a sense, the evidence forces me to believe it, but not in the way that you giving me a pill or moving my arms around would force me to do something. I just see the force of the evidence. So that's one way of communicating. Second bullet point is the alternative way, where the audience comes to believe or do something for reasons that are different from those that motivate the speaker to get the audience to believe or act. And here, think of cases like threatening, lying, or manipulation. And then maybe I'll just mention briefly threats and manipulation. So in a threatening case, the speaker tries to get fear to motivate the audience, and fear that doesn't motivate the speaker themselves. So suppose I say, look, I'm going to damage your career unless you pursue this research agenda. I'm trying to get you to pursue the research agenda for a particular reason, which is fear for your career. That's not why I want you to pursue the research agenda. I'm not fearful for your career, and that's why I want you to pursue it. I've got some other reason. Maybe I just want someone to do this or whatever. But there's a necessary disconnect between your reason for acting there and the speaker's reason. And I think manipulation can be like this too. Think of it's very old school this, but the kind of dodgy graphs on old political flyers that you sometimes get where, you know, the numbers, the axes have some really weirdly presented numbers, so it looks like such and such a party has a chance of winning in this constituency when it doesn't really. I mean, in this kind of case, again, I think that the speaker, in this case, the producer of the graph, if they have any sense of what they're doing, they won't believe we've got a chance of winning because of this thing I've presented. But they're hoping you'll think that. So again, they're hoping you'll come to a belief on the basis of a reason that isn't their own reason there. Because if they understood the graph at all and knew they were manipulating, then they'd know that it wasn't a good evidence for what they're presenting. So the summary then is that in these kind of cases where you've got this disconnect between what the speaker's trying to take to be the reason to motivate someone and what they want the audience to think and be motivated by, these kind of cases, I think the speaker's using the audience. It's not letting the audience make its mind up just on the basis of what the speaker believes, and that sort of unforced force of the reason of that. You're adding something as speaker. You're adding something that's more like bare power, threat or lie or whatever. And this makes the resulting decision not really free. If you buy a car and have been misled about the car's goodness or competence or whatever, then you're not really freely choosing to buy it. And so turning this back then to democratic deliberation, the thought is, if this stuff is going on in the debate before the vote, then the people who are the audience are not really free when they make their choices, and it doesn't any longer confer legitimacy on what's been voted for. And I mean, this is about misleadingness in general, most of what I've said there, but there are some real complications with statistical speech, and some of them have come up in what Ed was saying. I mean, one is that often the speaker for statistics, the speaker, say before, the place where Boris Johnson got those facts was an institutional speaker often. And I actually think you can assess institutions for honesty and for reliability and these sort of things, but it's much harder, I think, than in the individual speaker case. I also think often the speaker might be an expert, and I think experts have a special role in the public sphere. Maybe the standards they have to meet are higher. I think they also might, and I think you made a throwaway remark about this, Ed, they might, in expert cases, there might be a duty to speak as well, which I think there wouldn't be in the ordinary person debating about statistics kind of case. But if you're an expert on this, then part of your role is to do what the ordinary public doesn't have time to do. And so you've got to bring this to the public. Final thing was, I just wanted to mention a further complication is about emotion and rhetoric, because I think there's one way of hearing what I've said, and you often get this criticism of Habermas. When we're hearing what I've said, which says, oh, well, what we should go for then is a sort of impartial, neutral, non-emotional presentation of everything. And that's not what I'm trying to say, because I think that there are standards of reason that apply to emotions. I think emotions can be called for, can be an appropriate response to something. And sometimes the best way to present a piece of statistical information can involve, for example, a sort of story that gets you emotionally involved. I don't think that's a bad thing at all. I don't think that is a departure from the kind of thing I was presenting as good communication. But I think it does make things tricky, because there can be cases where sort of things slide over, and you think I actually think some of these politician cases, like the Boris Johnson one, are tricky. Did he believe in the stuff he was using? If he believed, perhaps he shouldn't have, because he should have taken more care, because he's got a special role too. But if he had taken care, really believed, then maybe I don't want to make that moral judgment of putting them in the bad case in the way I would have if they hadn't. Okay, so I just want to end by returning to the main point, which is that I think legitimate power is really important. Otherwise, we're just being bossed around, and that's no good. It requires open, honest debate, and misuse of statistics undermines this, and we end up just being bossed around by power because of the misuse of statistics.
Lots of food for thought there. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to pull out a couple of strands of what you've both said and try to see perhaps just explore some of those areas. One of the things that I was very caught by and it came from both of you, was around the whole aspect of the data that you've got and the relevancy of that data and whether or not that data is the appropriate data and then how it's presented. So there's a piece about data and there's a piece about, I think, a very big piece about communication. And in what particular circumstances do you use different styles of communication, perhaps? But if we go to the data, and I think, and there's also an aspect here about experts. I think probably the one of the long-lasting phrases that stuck with us all during the pandemic was, we're going to follow the science. And a lot of that science was presented as data. And the statistics were derived from that data, and then our behaviours were modified based on that information. What's your perspective, and what do you do when the data is constantly changing and you're asking policymakers and politicians to provide information for the population to follow that's based on fairly ropey graphs from time to time, but also that's based on perhaps information that is constantly changing? How do you do the fact checking, and how do you make those kind of sureties around the data in those sort of extreme circumstances?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm going to answer your question, but I'll say the thought that occurs to me as you were asking it, which is that during the pandemic, so like my day job is making sure that government departments and the Office for National Statistics and National Records Scotland, all of these bodies kind of do their job of providing a regular diet of estimates of population and crime and inflation and so on. It's kind of behind the scenes. And then suddenly in the pandemic, two things happened. One is that behind the scenes work, as you say, became the stuff of daily kind of consumption, really. But secondly, it was a very, very kind of emergent thing right at the beginning of the pandemic. The data were necessarily quite weak. They gradually improved. So in that context, what we had this very clear principle right from the outset. One is that we would not get in the way of statisticians trying to do, or scientists trying to do the right thing by trying to understand a phenomenon and get the data out. So we would always say, get the data out, worry about its quality second, but get the data out first. And then once you've got the data out, then you can start to refine the quality. So we did that on testing, we did it on the vaccine rollout, we did it on a lot of the hospitalization data. We said, first of all, make it available transparently, and the dashboard as well, actually. The original versions of the dashboard were really quite clunky. We didn't say you've got a clunky dashboard. We said it's great that you've done a dashboard, but you need to now work on it and iterate it. So I think there's a real sense of the good enough, and there's also the key ingredient. What I've just said is the humility of saying, we know this is an incomplete picture, but it's the best picture we have, and I think actually the scientists did that well. I think it was a very uneasy space for politicians, because politicians like to convey certainty. But when the politicians themselves acknowledged the uncertainty, I think they commanded more public confidence than when they portrayed a kind of, we're going to do 100,000 tests a day. By the way, you don't really know how we're going to count that kind of dynamic.
And Rowan, is that trustworthiness, that honesty in saying, actually, some of this data might not be as where we want it to be. Does that help us? Does it hinder us?
I think it's essential, even though quite often it might hinder. I mean, I think obviously we want it to be as trustworthy as possible, but if it's not, then yeah, we've got to be honest about it. I think one of the things that struck me, maybe hearing you speak, Ed, as well, was this sense that there is data out there, but so often people accessing it, even the experts are accessing it through a speaker, a communicator of that data. Yeah. And so there's sort of trust at all these different levels. And I think remembering that there's a speaker when you're looking at the evidence, the person who's saying the evidence, or the institution that's presenting it, is really important. And then, yeah, can you trust it or not? Personally, I would love it if people were much more honest about not being certain, and if we just thought that was the norm, and that's how we should go along. And then maybe we need interesting, this is where experts come in, interesting meta information about degrees of uncertainty and when uncertainty is relevant to this kind of stuff. I think all of that would be incredibly helpful.
I'm going to narrow it in a little bit. So there's a number of people in the audience who act as expert witnesses to the courts, and in our role in that domain and that specific, I suppose, application of our skill set, we're bounded to provide information that is helpful to the jurors, the public, essentially, or our legal colleagues in making a decision. So the decision is not for us to opine upon, although what we have to do is provide almost the translation of what our findings mean within that context, so that somebody else can come to a ruling. And often we are asked to present things in statistical ways, and we become quite uncomfortable about that, because sometimes we don't have the underpinning data. How do you deal with those kind of really tricky circumstances, do you think, where you're asking of an expert to provide a statistical, sometimes opinion, but an opinion on things that actually they don't want to go there, because it's not, firstly, their role, and secondly, they don't want to be misleading in terms of how the public, in this case the jury, might assimilate that information?
I certainly wouldn't presume to tell those of you in the audience who do this how to do your job, and I've never done it, and I don't know what it's like. I imagine it's a very challenging and demanding thing to do. But what I would say is, I think the things that Rowan and I have been talking about, which are sort of at the macro level of public discourse, probably do apply down into that specific, more specific context. You have a speaker, clearly, the expert in the case of the forensic evidence, and you have an audience who are the jurors. You actually have intermediaries who might be playing the role of the media, the intermediaries of the lawyers, the advocates. And therefore, I think that some of the things that we've been talking about really do apply in that context. For my zero in on the use, I think you'd say zero in on what the specific evidence is that you're talking about. Avoid the risk to be pulled away from that towards a broader narrative. I think certainly avoid giving a more, imparting moral significance to the findings that you're alleging. That's for the jurors. That is clearly for the jurors. And be pretty rigorous in going back to the source and sticking to the source and not being pushed off the source. But I think you probably know that much better than me. So in a sense, I would use that as a vehicle really to kind of repeat my points rather than say anything new or additional.
And does it let you repeat your points?
Maybe with an extra point, I think, which is, so I think in an ideal world, be honest about the limits of your expertise, and be honest about sort of just be as honest as you. It's really hard because you're trying to persuade the person by the thing that you see as the reason, and that might be something really complicated. Okay, so you're trying to persuade them by something that the ordinary person just doesn't have time or energy to grasp, and yet you've got to do your best then. So in an ideal world, just do your best at that. But the ideal world point, as this thought that, I have seen cases where this backfire. I remember at a conference I think you were at last time, where people were talking about, it wasn't a criminal justice case, but it was discussing climate change facts with members of the public. And I've seen cases where someone presented the evidence really carefully, said, here's the limits of my expertise, we can't be too certain about all this. And then you interview the public afterwards and they said, oh, well, they wasn't certain, so maybe I needn't worry after all. And so I think along with the ideal world honesty, there's work to be done, sort of changing a culture about what you expect from an expert, thinking expertise is going to be limited and difficult, and that there's limited, difficult stuff out there that you're going to have to hear as a member of the public, and that you shouldn't be annoyed when the expert has limits of expertise. You should, I don't know. So it's really hard. I worry there's a sort of collective action problem here sometimes, that experts are sort of driven out of the fear of being misleading to sort of present themselves as more more certain, and that leads the public to expect more certainty, and it all goes in the wrong direction. We've somehow got to change the culture. So
that's a big one. How do we change the culture? I was going to ask.
People always in this context, they go straight to kind of education and statistical literacy, and I sort of resist going there first. I think it's part of the picture. One of the reasons I resist going there first, I think it's rather patronising. Actually, it's sort of saying what we say is fine. It's just you, the great unwashed, can't understand the brilliance of ours. That's a bit patronising. One thing I think is I always worry about is a culture of discourse in which numbers are weaponized, which I think is a new phenomenon. Actually, I'd love to have some political scientists tell me whether it is, but I'm fairly certain that this sort of, I've got a number and I'm going to use it over and over again. 25% of Europe's offshore wind capacity is in Scotland. 430,000 more people in employment. There are many other examples of a number that probably the first time it was used with care and thought, but just becomes this sort of pounding away. I think that's a really corrosive feature. I said when we were chatting earlier, I gave a talk in Southampton University just to prove I try and cover the whole of the UK last week, and there I said that it was a sort of light-hearted thing. I said that if you hear a number being repeated over and over again, it's probably being misused. That's a rule of thumb. If it's going to hear it being appearing over and over again, probably it started to be used in a way that is stretching it away from what it actually was originally meant to say. So that's a bit of the culture, I think, that we can all just laugh at it and ridicule it. It's a silly feature of discourse.
Just an aside, and it's not just in politics. I think we see that all the time in management and in businesses too. Focus on KPIs, things that are measurable. Then that might not, the thing we really want might not be measurable, or not in such an easy way.
And I suppose it's that sort of constant requirement or ask of us to be able to give those numbers, those KPIs, as you said. So, and it raises a really important topic, I think, which is how do we go from the accuracy and the real numbers through perhaps people who use those numbers to write a piece of policy to then inform politicians or climate activists or whomsoever it might be. And that journey in of itself is one that it seems to me to be challenging and potentially fraught with pitfalls. How do you make those individuals link up, and perhaps, should it just be by talking with each other and producing a number at the other end? Should we be using different types of visualization tools these days? What's the best approach so that we, as the people who are hugely affected by some of the decisions are made, have confidence that those decisions are the right ones?
There used to be a strategy for the UK statistical system called better statistics, better decisions. The strategy's got a different name now, but this was a few years ago. Better statistics, better decisions. And I always thought, that's quite a nice phrase, right? But there's a lot in that comma. How much work is that comma doing? Better statistics, for all these reasons, all of this, passage from, the thoughtful work done by statisticians to identify what's needed to be estimated and gather the data and then put it through a methodology and then report it carefully. Then that gets into the hands of a policymaker who thinks, well, this will really help us understand this problem, and they write a policy paper, through to the minister who's got to communicate it in Parliament, through to the compression of all of that into a soundbite. Through to what's going on in the head of the citizen who is weighing all of that up in the cacophony of things that they're hearing. So my answer to your question is, I think we need to understand what's in that comma so much better than we do. I think it's massively under-researched, actually. So I don't know what things I don't know. I don't know the answer, but study the comma. Study the comma.
I won't say much. Just something. I love that. I really love that, and I think that comma. Think about the roles in that comma too. So there's better statistics, better decisions. Who are the decision makers? Ultimately, the public. But the public can't do it, not in a patronising way. They just don't have time. Thinking of who was it who said that socialism takes too many evenings? Was that, I can't remember. but Oscar Wilde maybe, but anyway, so yeah, the thought that you can't have the public, that there isn't time for it. So we've got this division of labour in decision making, and so the comma involves presenting the reasons properly to politicians, but also experts having this role, the public ultimately being the decider, and all of that role stuff, that division of labour, is built into that comma too, and that makes it even harder, I think, because I think a lot of these roles in the past have been used for unjust ends. You know, you've had unjust inclusion within the expert roles, you've had unjust exclusion of certain sort of expertise that is counted as not proper expertise. So you've got all of those questions about justice in the split up of roles, and yet we need the roles. That's all in that comma.
So, time for more questions. Anybody in the room got one? Okay. Yes, up at the top, John.
I wonder if you could say a little something about sophistication of the audience or audiences. You've hinted, maybe referred indirectly a little bit to it. In the comma, we have several audiences, I think, several audience roles. The voter who's misled by the dodgy graph is a different audience member, and the juror or the judge in the trial is, again, needs to be sophisticated enough to understand the arguments being presented to them. You could tell us something about what you think about that?
Yeah, I'll say, yeah, I suppose I was thinking a lot about statistics as spoken, so that, yeah, as the speaker, and you're right, we should think just as much about the audience. And I suppose the stuff I'm trying to present, which I suppose is controversial in political theory, not everyone thinks you should be just trying to use reason ultimately, which is what I would say. But I think if you really believe that, then that doesn't mean you should be patronising or sort of talk down to your audience, but you should think about something like the time and role the audience is in and what can be expected of them, I guess. And so I suppose, yeah, the ordinary member of the public is one thing. I can't remember what was the, the jury case. I suppose people have much more time there. You've got to think they've got time to think this through. You should be willing to really try and bring them on board with what you see as the reasons, I think, and think that officially they at least have the time to think about it. That's off the top of my head.
Yeah, I find myself sometimes falling into the trap, and I think I have done a little bit in my comments today, of dividing the world up into the speakers and an atomized audience, and the atomized audience being citizens. But of course, citizens cover an enormous range of sort of interests. And there's also some really important intermediaries. And the example that I like to think of here is, imagine some parents who have a child, and unfortunately the child has a rare condition. Now they may be sophisticated sort of data analysts, but they may well not be. They may have work in other walks of life. But the moment that they get that diagnosis, they're suddenly put into a new role in their life. Yeah. Perhaps sadly, perhaps it works out, where they get to engage and they speak to the surgeons. And they become experts, by force of their experience, they become experts. And they're probably helped by representative groups, patient groups, charities that themselves kind of do some of that heavy lifting for them. So I think the idea that there are, so I suppose my point is that those people, that couple who have that child, in that particular aspect of their lives, they get quite a grounded, deep expertise, but they still might not have that much interest in the UK, how to measure UK labour productivity. So I think we need to be very, very sophisticated in our thinking about audiences, that each individual might be a different audience for a different topic. There might be something they really care about or really not. So yes, if there's an extent to which I've slightly implied that the audience is kind of one and indivisible, that's a mistake. That's me being misleading, actually. So sorry.
Just a second, I'm going to take one of the online questions, then we'll come back into the room. Great,
okay. So the desire to lend credibility to policies that are rarely evidence-based is a misuse of science that politicians are very prone to. For this reason, I think scientists generally need to avoid cosy relationships with politics. If politicians aren't getting a kick up the backside every time they come within the range of scientists, I think science is failing, or am I too cynical? So that's a question from Gavin online.
Ed, I think we'll give that one to you.
Did the person have a name?
Gavin.
Gavin. Yeah.
Gavin, I think you're probably, if there was a spectrum of cynicism, you're probably quite at the cynical end of the distribution. I mean, you're right, of course, there is a lot of that sort of cross-dressing. I think of it as people who are wanting to advocate a particular policy which support their particular political narrative, but dressing it up with the sort of what they see as the legitimacy of science, and thereby I think corroding both the policy and the science. But I don't think that's universally true, and I think there are contexts in which policymakers, both civil servants and politicians, can understand the division of roles. They can draw on the science appropriately, and can do a good job. So I'd say probably, Gavin, that what I would subscribe to is not complete cynicism, but maybe a bounded cynicism. A bounded cynicism with some opportunity for what's the opposite of cynicism?
Optimism.
Optimism.
Let's get a bit of optimism.
Optimism. Yes.
Rowan, should we be cynical or optimistic?
I'm not going to answer that. I'm not going to answer that. I mean, I'm just going to say a question you could ask yourself about politicians in these cases is something like, are they just using the science to support what they anyway would be pushing, or does the science play some? That's good. Does it play some additional role in their reasoning and thinking, you know, this makes the policy a better one to push? And that seems to be the mark of whether it's been misused or not. The first one's the misuse. You just think, this is what I want. Oh, I'll find whatever I can to support it. And then, you know, that's in some sense dishonest in the way I was trying to present. You're not really just, you're hiding the fact that your true reason is just you go for this whatever, you know, as a politician. So that's a question I think is worth asking. I think things about getting close or apart and institutional design and funding of science, I think it's really hard, says me not answering the question. I think it is really hard to work out how these roles should be funded to keep the right separation. Yeah.
So another aspect on this, which I think maybe be back in my space of sort of a shard of optimism within the bounded cynicism, is that policy making is very rarely a linear relationship between here's a piece of evidence and here's your conclusion.
Yeah.
It's much more of a synthesis. It's a synthesis of evidence from multiple sources, some of it quite hard, the kind of evidence that I sort of deal with, you know, statistical measurements, statistical estimates. Some of it will be softer, some of it will be qualitative. Politicians, you know, when you meet them, they are extremely good at gauging and ascertaining public sort of appetite and public perceptions in ways that are, you know, quite dazzling when they can say, I think people won't, you know, like that, and they turn out that they're right. They've got that sort of antennae, and policymaking is a synthesis of those things. And I think probably the reason to be cynical is when what is actually a synthetic judgment from multiple sources is presented as a kind of ineluctable scientific truth. As I say, that corrodes both the science and the policy. But if they celebrate that synthesis, I think we shouldn't say it's a bad thing that politicians draw in evidence from a wide range of sources to reach often very difficult judgments. That I'm glad it's not my job. I have it easy to decide whether they're being misleading. I don't have to decide, you know, how do we solve the housing crisis or whatever it might be.
Anyone else before Anne, and then we'll come to Simon.
I'd just like to go back to the an insight, but maybe for psychology. As an expert, we're not actually trying to sway people one way or another. All we're trying to do is actually get them to, I guess, come on board and believe what we believe.
Yeah.
And it's more the lawyers that are actually trying to take that, I guess, source of what we're saying, to then bring the jury to believe what they believe one way or the other. How does that affect the way that we should potentially present evidence if we're trying to, in the scenario that you've built up, Rowan, around do we get them to believe or do we get them to believe for a different reason, whereas all we want them to believe is what we say.
Yeah.
Why they believe it, we don't, you know, we're not too worried about it. Is there a space in there? Would we approach it differently? Because it's going to be used as the source for the lawyers then to get the jury to believe one way or another with them, however, for whatever reason they do that. is there a difference in how it should be presented or not?
I can say something if you like. I think it's tough, so I'm scared to say the wrong thing here. But off the top of my head, off the top of my head, because I haven't thought enough about the courts actually. Off the top of my head, my instinct is to say that you're still trying to get them to believe something, as you kind of revealed in your question by the end. You're just trying to get them to believe the thing you're expert on, and this particular fact. You're trying to get them to have a belief about something, aren't you? Otherwise, why are you communicating? Yeah.
Source.
Yes.
We're not getting them to believe our
Okay, so
it's not like a politician or a lawyer.
No.
We want them to find them guilty, not guilty. We actually just want, this is the source, which we're back to the 430,000.
Yes. So you're trying to get them to believe that source.
430,000, not that we've got the best policy.
Yeah. So I would have thought even there you want to stick with that sort of honesty. Like if you give them a drug that made them believe the source, you don't want to do that, or if you don't want to threaten them to believe the source or whatever. You still want to get them to believe the source because it's good evidence, and just see the evidence and be persuaded by that. That's a bit of a bland answer, like how you do that. But I suppose, I think it seems right that because of the way the roles the court split up, that's all you should be doing, is getting them to believe that. And so you should thinking of it in that way. I hope that helps. I don't know.
I feel as though that exchange you had was really helpful in sort of like supporting the things that Rowan and I have been saying and sort of contextualizing them into the expert witness context, and the way you related it to the 430,000 actually being not that dissimilar from the things that you as an expert witness do. That's actually very helpful, I think. Thank you.
I'm going to take, I know we have one, I'll take another question online. Let's go to Simon first here in the room, and then we'll do the online ones. I think there's somebody else who's in the audience who I might want to ask questions. Simon.
Picking up on a couple of things, I think one thing that's been missed so far is the cognitive psychology element. Choose my words very, very carefully. Our brains are lazy. We look for the shortcuts and everything, and I think that's where the education element comes in, particularly with juries, for contextualising it. That said, it can go badly wrong. Going back a few years. At the time, a very well-respected pathologist spouted out a soundbite of 1 in 73 million. And we all know how the Sally Clark case ended up, which brings me to my broader point about adversarial systems going beyond criminal justice. In that it doesn't really matter which political party is potentially misusing statistics, they all do it. And brings me a little bit to pick on you, Ed, I'm sorry. In that if your organisation had a little bit more teeth or a little bit more public focus or image, or I don't know what, just more visible, and there was a bit more accountability of politicians and elected officials doing this sort of dodgy stuff, that would then filter down, do you think? Or do you think you have enough teeth? I don't know.
So I'll meet you halfway. I think we wouldn't want any more teeth than we have, but I would like more visibility. So I think you put forward a lack of visibility and a lack of teeth. So teeth in this context would mean, I guess, the ability to fine or the ability to compel or something like that. And I just can't conceive of how you would say, I'm going to fine you for this political statement that you've made. That would feel very, very strange. What I can yearn for is, and this is, I think, something that, we should be held to account for more. We're not as visible as we could be. I'm sure several of you in the audience have heard of us, but I'm sure several others of you haven't. Probably more of you haven't. And I think the more people that are aware that this function takes place and that we do clarify the interpretation of statistics and we do form a view and make that available publicly, I think that would really help with the sort of general culture of taking this stuff seriously. So I'll meet you halfway on the teeth and the visibility thing. Maybe I'll stop there. Because I think the psychology stuff is interesting as well. But can I lob that to you?
Yeah, you can lob that to me. I just wanted to reinforce what you said actually about teeth and visibility, because I mean, I've got no financial connection to the organisation, so I'm giving you a plug here. But it's not. But just if you have a look at the website, it is really you are really thoughtful in a lot of your judgments, and they're really thought through on the website. And it is just a real pity that people don't that this isn't more public. I think if you had more teeth, that would be harder because that require more sort of in some ways democratic accountability to be able to do less independence, and so as in less independence from the public actually would be necessary if you were to have more teeth. So so that's interesting. Just on the cognitive bias stuff. Yes, I had a thought and it's just gone out of my head. Sorry.
Is that a joke? On the cognitive bias stuff, I had a thought. It's gone out of my head.
My brain
Is that the recency bias or something? Sorry, but is it helping?
Now, gentlemen,
Is it getting further and further away?
It's gone. I mean, it was. I suppose it was certainly something in my head when I was presenting all the stuff at the start. I was like, this is assuming that we can all think clearly, and of course we can't all the time. Oh no, yeah, I'm beginning to remember some of it now, which was something like, I think it's tied into questions of social justice actually too. So I think we could address a lot of cognitive biases by addressing a lot of questions in justice that will affect people's understanding of things like the expert role. Make it more trustable, make the public more trusted by experts. I think that would address some of the biases, not all of them, but just wanted to throw that out there. I think it's really tied into massive questions about justice.
Can I take one more question online and then we'll go for one final one if it's in the room?
Yeah. So one from online, and this is from Ken, perhaps one for Rowan. Are there models that help us understand the broader set of components or enablers of good public debate? As a specific example, less or no misleadingness from politicians or advocates may be one component, but we also need public openness to different information and perspectives. This openness may not always be there in some contexts. There is interesting evidence on trust and polarization that show that. And in the US, some groups, Republicans, do not even trust official statistics on ocean temperature.
Who's that from, sorry?
Ken.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'll start with a different plug and then more of an answer. So the plug is, this is something I've been trying to work on with colleagues from University of Warwick, Fabian Peter and Natalie Ashton, University of Amsterdam, and Jonathan Hayward, who has a role working on press regulation. And we've just been trying to think, can we come up with a list of sort of norms for public debate which will help ensure legitimacy? And it's very, very hard. We've been thinking about, especially in the digital age, we've been thinking what kind of that does for it. But I just want to plug this stuff we've been doing. It's called the Norms for the New Public Sphere project. So if you want to look at that, you can see the stuff it's saying at the moment is, I think, not that surprising. It's things to like honesty, presenting your reasons clearly, avoiding things where there's obvious evidence against it. There are some maybe more surprising things in there, things to do with, for example, allowing people a bit of respite in this busy digital world, a bit of respite from having to think all the time as a citizen. But I just wanted to plug that. The other thing I wanted to say was that I think something we perhaps haven't said quite enough in this so far and is relevant to the question is about the public themselves as experts, and how far we need to sort of recognise that, we being me as a member of the public and me in a sort of expert role. So I suppose I think this, I felt this came up in the pandemic, actually, thinking about people saying they're following the science. Well, the science doesn't actually tell you what to do in a pandemic. It tells you if the science is good, and maybe, I don't know if the numbers were good enough, if the science is good, it can tell you things like, if you lock down, there'll be so many lives saved compared to if you do something different. But do we want to save those lives at the expense of that lack of freedom? That's a more moral question, where I would want to say that the expertise is sort of spread unevenly through the public. You know, so there's expertise in people who know what it's like to have someone they love die in hospital, or who know how hard it is to try and work from home while you're looking after a family. And this isn't the expertise that the scientists have. And I don't think there are moral experts. I don't think philosophers are moral experts, actually, even moral philosophers. I think expertise on these sort of evaluative questions is more out there in the public, and that's, yeah, I just wanted to add that. So that's something else to listen to.
I don't know if you want to input in that. So I thought there was one more question. Yes, sir, please.
It's a small one. It's more about arguing that the Office for Regulators things shouldn't have voting. Because once you have a ministry for factfulness, that's a very powerful entity. A powerful entity that would be very prone to corruption. So the answer question is, how do you avoid corruption in the Office for Statistical Regulation? Not so much in what they do choose to investigate, but probably what they choose not to investigate, because we've all seen egregious claims being made online and elsewhere that just people accept.
Yeah.
This is the way the world is, even though it's plain, it's the sky, that it's not the way the world is. So how would you go about avoiding
That's
corruption?
a cracking last
Yeah,
question.
it is. Well, let me begin by agreeing with your sort of first point, which is you wouldn't want this organisation that I'm responsible for to have more kind of enforcement powers. I don't think that would be helpful. And actually, thinking about my answer to the earlier question, another point that I would make is that what outcome do we want? The outcome that we want is that people are not misled as to what the statistics say. I'm not particularly interested in an outcome which is this particular person has been embarrassed by a stinging rebuke. Now, frankly, quite often that is how our stuff gets reported. And I feel as though if that's the price to pay to get the correct interpretation out. But the objective is the interpretation, not the coverage. And I think teeth would make the story ever more about the wrongdoing, not the right doing. And we want it to be about the right doing. In terms of how we ourselves kind of ensure that we make appropriate judgments, we try and be, the answer is transparency. We try and be demonstrate our trustworthiness through transparency. So we have very clear policies on interventions, when we make interventions, how we make them. We publish the interventions that are made, not in all cases, because if it's a private correspondence from a member of the public where we're clarifying something for them, we would not publish it unless we had their permission. But the big ticket ones we publish. So there's a transparency about those judgments. And the other point is people can raise things with us. So we have a thing on our website which is raise a concern. You can go there, you can raise it, you've seen something, you can raise a concern, and we commit to always answering that. So if there's a sense that we've missed something, we will. We might still decide we don't want to look at it. That's true, but we have to give you a reason. We have to give you a reason. And the other point is our independence. So I report to a board. For anywhere near ministers, I report to a board which itself reports to Parliament. So we're separate from the ministerial control process. And I have my role is a statutory role. I'm called the head of assessment in the Act, and that gives a degree of sort of protection. So there are protections. I mean, if you replaced me with someone who had a different value set, could things go wrong? Possibly. I'd hope the transparency would catch it. But yeah, I hope that gives some sort of answer to your question.
Super. Thank you very much indeed. We've come to the end of our time. It's kind of sped through. Absolutely fascinating, gentlemen. Thank you so much. And I think a really, really interesting perspective from both of you around what are difficult, challenging areas. I think that the big take home from an academic perspective is we need to go and write a research grant for the comma. So
Yeah.
that we can what is it we're going to do there? Gosh, there's a big knotty question in that. Folks, thank you so much indeed for your coming along today and for your really interesting questions. Thank you to our online audience as well for sticking with us and for a fascinating debate. And I'll ask you to show your appreciation in the normal way.
Yeah, thanks.